Thank you for coming today. We are having an artist talk with Katrina Majkut, who has curated In Control, which is in our gallery until May 4th. And it's a very interesting exhibition, has been very well reviewed here in Chicago, and has gotten a great response. You have a lot of followers, Katrina, and a lot of people just telling us how much they respect your work. So, yeah. So I don't know if I should start or if Alex, you want to start. I think we could kind of go either way.
And I'm Alex Senycia, and I run WEMA's social channels and lead marketing. And just wanted to say the response on social media has been really great to this show. People are really interested in it, and the post gets such high engagement. I think because the series is so topical and political, and kind of with that, and all the sensitivities around conversations about birth control and abortion in America, how do you handle portraying such sensitive topics in your artwork?
So I am really careful about that. I think one of the things that I take into consideration very seriously is that everyone comes to these topics with a preconceived notion. And I would go so far as to say a miseducation. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there really isn't comprehensive sex ed in the United States right now. A lot of people are misled by their own parents, miseducation, their friends, their whatever kind of communities that they're in. And so my responsibility is to approach the subjects with medical and scientific honesty. By removing the person, I mean, there's a very strong history of showing all these products as they relate to their person. It's really giving it some scientific weight to consider the actual object at hand and what is it needed for physically, biologically, to operate and live a healthy life every single day. And so I consult with doctors, nurses, OBGYNs, pharmacists, whoever is a professional that's related into the field. And yeah, I make sure that I approach it with medical honesty. And that is reiterated in my wall text that explains the medical efficacy, how it's used, the statistics. And when my stitching skills might fail, just because the object is too abstract, I'll actually include the real object. And that sort of weights it in reality. But also, a really good example is one of the pieces is a sponge. And no one has ever seen a sponge, really. Most people have heard of it because they've watched Seinfeld. But it's kind of this circular squishy thing. And to depict that in cross stitch is not going to necessarily come across well. So I include the actual object, and it's a very eye-opening experience to see in person.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely loved the mix of like objects and the embroidery and the juxtaposition and like the textures too visually. And then Adrienne, I know you had some questions specifically on the medium since you touched on that.
I do have some questions. You mentioned you use observational techniques from painting, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that. Are there specific ones you're interested in more than others, and maybe why?
So I'm a classically trained painter. I studied how to paint realistically, which you use observational painting as the way to learn that. And basically, you set up your still life and you paint from life. There is usually a little sketching. There's a lot of layering of colors. So you have to have a basis in color theory. This is really helpful when working with a medium like embroidery that is opaque, linear. It's hard to create depth as you would maybe in a painting. So it's challenging in that sense, but a lot of embroiderers will use computer programming to create a map on how to create their object. They might sketch it out. There's a whole bunch of techniques that you can use, but I do strictly through sight to hand.
Mhm.
That's kind of unique for my own brand as an artist. And yeah, I enjoy the process. I like the challenge.
Mhm.
Wow, that's incredible. I dabble in embroidery art too, and I definitely need a map before starting like the actual embroidery process. So that's incredible.
Yeah. I
Um,
won't write down the lettering. I will
okay,
sketch that out simply because working within a gridded system, embroidery is so unforgiving that if you mess up and you remove it, it leaves a lint,
yeah.
and plus your spacing could be off. So that's the only time I write it down.
Can I ask you, Katrina, what does the back of your fabric look like?
So I know there's a Ukrainian tradition to make sure the back of your fabric is as neat as possible. It should be as well organized and beautiful as the front. I do not carry on this one tradition. I think my technique's a little bit more sporadic because I'm not working with a pattern. And there's a lot of improvisation going on within my art making. So yeah, not as neat.
I was curious. I had to ask simply because
Mm,
I've been under that pressure as well, and could really identify with how I learned also embroidery at about the same age that you did, and from my grandmother actually who lived with us, and so that really I could completely relate to what you were saying about this being passed on through generations and such. And it brings me to another question, partly because, I mean, all of us share a Ukrainian identity in our backgrounds. And you, there's a large percentage of embroidery, particularly in the blouses and also ritual cloths and such that bear are images of fruit, of flowers, other produce, for lack of a maybe nicer term, that come from nature. And it's certainly been argued that Ukrainian culture is very organic. In other words, very focused on life cycles, seasonal cycles, nature cycles. And much of this, of course, is really rooted in pre-Christian traditions, like we see on Pisankiv, for example, or Easter eggs. And in thinking about how deeply you researched this to really address women as living persons with real issues and just all the work and decision making that has to go into making decisions about healthcare and reproduction and so on. Um, I wondered if there was a kind of, the associations with embroidery with these produce type patterns are related to birth also in reproduction and fertility. So there are these kind of parallels in both. Oh, and I wondered if that was anything that came to you when you were exploring this in its contemporary um,
mhm.
vocabulary.
So when I usually lecture on this, I do usually bring up the history of embroidery dating back to medieval times, and the influence of the Catholic Church on what motifs were permissible for women to stitch, because they were basically the ones who dictated that.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm just guessing on this now that you bring it up, since so many of, especially the Ukrainian motifs that you're speaking of that are originally pagan, were appropriated by the churches.
Yes.
Um, there's probably, like, you could probably even go even further back in terms of my research and uh, as to how like women had been portrayed within embroidery and how their value has been placed when it comes to their fertility and their ability to create families. So it
Mhm.
probably goes much further back than my research.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think there's a connection there. And in terms of realizing how women are recognized as human beings and how that's connected to embroidery, I really like to talk about how embroidery has been used sort of as um, propaganda, essentially, to define what it means to be a woman, a wife, and a mother. The problem with that is that it's been entirely divorced from the physicality of those roles, the things we experience every single day to manage our health, to have families or to not have families, um, to be those whole beings and to encapsulate that physicality are completely divorced from the themes that we see within embroidery, which have been used to define our gender identities. And so I'm trying to correct those historical omissions. There's no reason why they should be divorced. These are part of our everyday lives. This is what we do to feel good and happy. Yeah, so that's kind of like the larger mission of the In Control series.
Mhm. Thank you.
So to follow up on kind of that historical context that you just outlined, that kind of, gives the background for your embroidery practice. How does that context surrounding like the domestic traditional functions of samplers, like challenge, like how do your works challenge those narratives, I guess, that are traditionally like, surrounding embroidery is what I'm trying
So
to say.
if
Yeah.
we're speaking strictly from like an American perspective, although I'm sure it's tied to European as well, young colonial girls were taught to make samplers within school so that they could essentially have this resume to prospective husbands to show that they could make socks,
Mhm.
make clothing, darn socks. And what was represented in those motifs were either religious, rudimentary, academic, or pastoral. Those were the themes that were fitting of a becoming woman, a good potential wife. And so, and I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, we're gonna have to edit this out.
Totally.
Sorry, your original question.
Um,
Historical.
yeah, like how does your work kind of like subvert that narrative or like make it
Oh.
contemporary? Yeah.
So by stitching all of these themes, not only do I think I'm creating a modern representation of what like women uh, go through every day in those roles, I'm also doing away with the traditional notion of what a sampler is. I'm just sort of, there's somewhere between modernizing it and abandoning it, however you want to interpret that journey.
My
Okay.
sense also is that you're exposing what women are feeling and thinking about when they're embroidering these samplers so often, kind of, having cramps or a hot flash or pregnant or not, or I mean, it's also kind of about feelings also.
Yeah, it's really nice to interact with the viewers with the work because a lot of people feel seen and represented. And, I come from a generation where women were hiding their tampon in their sleeve when they were at work and going to the bathroom. This was something that you weren't supposed to talk about. You were just supposed to suffer in silence. And that goes for a lot of things from childbirth to menopause, like you said. And, when you're confronted with the object, I'm really hoping to demystify these things that we have treated as a society as taboo and to show that they're not so scary and that if you just provide, scientific and medical understanding to them, they're manageable.
Mhm.
Um, People shouldn't live in shame because they get their periods.
Right.
Uh, yeah.
Although I have to say, we've had some of our elders who've come by to see the show and they've been uncomfortable with it because, they didn't even have ultrasounds then. I mean, this was, they're still not comfortable with it. And so it's almost like they don't want to look. in order
Mhm.
to maintain maybe a sense of propriety or to respect their wife, or I'm not quite sure what the significance of that is for them personally, but I've noticed those kind of reaction by some of our elder males.
So I think that's what is powerful about making this an art series and using art as a platform to discuss it. Um, I'm trying to find an opportunity where people can view these with the, how do I say this? Rather than confronting it face on, this is a more comfortable way to view it. Even if in a more comfortable platform, it's still uncomfortable, baby steps for people.
Right.
Um, and I do think there's something about the softness that I'm using this process of cross stitch that's more associated with grandmothers, that it takes people's biases and guard down just like a little bit, which is usually why I'm not confronted violently or very challenged. So yeah, I think there's something to the stereotype of the material that helps ease people into this a little bit better. I'm not going to win everyone, I admit that,
Mhm.
but I'm trying.
I wondered if I could jump in. I don't know, Alex, and just, you probably have another question, but it kind of segues to this. What struck me about in looking at all of the images, together, the rape kit one is painful,
Mhm.
to see, uh, for a number of reasons. There's so many steps to what is included in a kit. It's so invasive to the victim after what they've already experienced, and it's just such a signal of, it's just such a reminder of violence and brutality. And um I was wondering if you're, in your research, or maybe, some of the comments you've had or reactions, if that it's set apart from the other works. And what was that like, or what is that like for you? Or
So as I got further on in the series, the product started to become more and more violent. And I think that really just has to do with the fact that there's so much misunderstanding and uh, such roughness that are applied to women's experiences. And when I say women, I'm sorry, I also include like other people who may use these products. It's not exclusive to people who identify as women. Uh, and so I think the violence of the objects really just has to do with the fact that when it comes to reproductive rights, it's also called the war on women. A lot of the products in the show have violent beginnings. Like there's a speculum in the show. The speculum has a nightmare of an origin on how it was like tested on Black women because the medical community thought that Black women couldn't feel pain. And it was done without anesthesia. Like it's horrible. The birth control pill also has like a horrible history of testing. And so when it comes to the rape kit, I think it has multiple layers. It's to raise awareness as to how invasive it is and how it deserves a redesign. How this thing that's supposed to bring bodily justice to the survivor is not necessarily true because there's such a backlog of them. And then so many people turn down a rape kit because there's so much fear of the unknown of them. So I kind of wanted to demystify what all the steps are like. But even that's complicated because, going back to the original point, it is very invasive. In terms of reactions, I think it's complicated mostly because it hits so many notes that are personal, that strike fear, that incite memories for some people. There was one time though where I saw a woman crying and I was like, oh, this is that moment where this work has really hurt someone. And so I approached her and I was like, I'm the artist. I can leave you alone if you want to be with your thoughts, or we can talk about it. And she actually wanted to talk about it. And we talked for a half hour. It was the most important interaction I've ever had as an artist. And she talked about how, essentially, as painful as it was to see this thing, it made her feel seen, because not only did her friends and family not believe what she had experienced, but they didn't understand or believe how hard it was to find justice in her experience. They didn't believe that to go through that process was difficult and caused its own pain. And yeah, it was like a really powerful conversation. And she was so glad it existed, for as uncomfortable as it made her, because it had a greater social purpose. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most special parts of the show, is that you relate to the work, you see yourself in the work, because we've all had different experiences with different types of birth control, or tampons versus pads, or just, embarrassing period stories, or, difficulties, whatever it is. Like when I went with my friend, she's premenopausal. And when we got to the chill pill, she was like, oh my God, am I going to need something like that? It's just so relatable. Seeing the show, it made me think, I can't believe, almost like couldn't believe an art piece like this didn't exist before. So how did you conceive of this show? Was it something that you had thought about for a long time, and it was a specific kind of like moment in like history, all this recent history, that you decided to execute? Or what are the origins?
So I was living in Berkeley, California in around 2010, and it was the site of a lot of social movements. It was the start of Occupy. It was the start, they were arguing Prop 8 over there. So it was the start of marriage equality. It was the start of the Black Lives Matters movement. There was just so much going on around me, and Obama was pushing for birth control to be covered by insurance. And I was about to go to grad school, and I was really bored by kits. I wanted to do something more challenging in the space. And it seems like such a basic notion to start stitching these products. I was sure someone had already done it before, but I haven't found that person still. And yeah, I just kept going and going. And it turned out it was this radical idea, is just to stitch these straightforward objects as is, to be nonpartisan. And I include a lot of products that I don't personally use or necessarily politically agree with. It's about having a really comprehensive idea of all the products within the space of family planning, reproductive health. And so I love getting suggestions from people about what I should stitch. Like I get a lot of people in menopause who tell me I should stitch more. Cancer's not represented. I have so many friends that have gotten breast cancer. I'm sure that's really important to represent. I just lost my sister-in-law to ovarian cancer. That's something that's really important to represent. And so I have a very long list. I'm also realizing that with all the political news that I have to start including medical objects that relate to trans lives and trans health. Like that should be part of the scope of the series as well. So it's always growing. I'm always learning, which is the most important thing that I think I've learned, is to have empathy for others and to learn and listen. Because as much as I think I know about something, there's probably a lot more that I don't know. And so it's been a really great journey developing this work.
Yeah, and the journey is continuing. It's
Yeah.
exciting that you're continuing to keep it alive and add to it as you learn new things and new things come to light.
Mm-hmm.
What was the first object? Oh, sorry, Adrienne. I was just going to ask, what was the first object you started with?
It had to have been the birth control blister pack, I think. And then the IUD was pretty early on as well.
Cool. Go ahead, Adrienne.
I wanted, something that I found interesting was that we had conversations amongst ourselves, staff, about what we knew or didn't know based on our age and what some of it was just certain products weren't available. Some of it was they're available, but you still don't know because you will go to a doctor for a specific issue, but you won't necessarily be told everything because you're there for 20 minutes. And so it was very educational, for persons that are assumed to know about these things, to have a kind of comprehensive understanding. And it does also speak to, because I've taught gender and sexuality in modern art, I've had students mention, they went to a religious high school or are in a were in a very conservative community and had no awareness of AIDS or how this, as one example, as a health issue, it was just very limited knowledge because these were board decisions within these private schools, whether to teach or not teach it, and then how comprehensive do they go with it. So it's very illustrative and was very helpful. Actually, I find your project is very helpful. I think actually it'd be very helpful in such classes as well.
Yeah, I had not intended to make a series that became essentially a sex education for people who saw it. I really started with this impetus of sort of correcting what was out there in embroidery and representing, women or people with periods. So it has evolved into that, and I don't regret it. I think it's good and important. Because there's so much information out there. And because of all that misinformation, this explains where we are politically today.
It does. Well, there's also one old wives' tales, or myths about not being able to get pregnant if you're breastfeeding. So sort of our older, generations where you have very closely born children, sometimes I've been told, oh, well, that's what we thought. We were wrong. Yeah.
That's why the wall labels for the show are so important. And I make sure that I do really good research around it. Everything's cited, everything's done reliably. I want to be able to say I could put it into a college paper and it holds muster in terms of the research.
Totally. And this is maybe the only show I've ever seen where I felt like the wall labels are so truly essential to the work. Like I almost can't imagine the work without the context and education that the labels give. Which, and all the work that you put into them really speaks to it. And it shows. It shows. Did you ever consider portraying this series in another medium, like painting, for example, like you mentioned, or you always knew it had to be cross-stitching?
No, it had to be cross-stitching. I had the idea. I never looked back. It really speaks to its place as gendered propaganda and why it's so effective. Also, it's very corporal, the medium. You lick the end of the string to thread the needle. The needle, I'm sure there's blood on there somewhere because the needle pricked my finger. And you're always holding it and holding it. There's a lot of embroidery artists now that use machinery to make their work because it is just so time consuming. And it makes a lot of demands on your body to do this by hand. Like it kills your eyesight, your posture's bad. So I think that physicality that's hidden within the work is still important in terms of the subject matter. It's a little bit more on the violent side. There was a great quote out of the Women's March in 2016. I think it was a big embroidery sign. And I'm sorry, I don't know who to credit for this. I made this just so I could stab something 7,000 times to express her frustration around reproductive rights and the treatment of women in this country.
Of course, of course. Well, and you've got DNA in there too.
Yeah.
I was wondering how the cross stitch compares to, let's say, needlepoint.
So I think of embroidery as a tree. Cross stitch is on one branch, and needlepoint is like on a nearby branch, where needlepoint's essentially just half stitches
Mhm.
and it's fully covered, versus cross stitch are small X's that there's negative space usually within cross stitch, whereas needlepoint will cover in the space completely.
True, true. This leads me to ask you, since you mentioned the cross stitches and X, is this also symbolically important? I mean, as X and Y are kind of, female and male symbols, that's really maybe stretching it, but thought I'd
You know what?
ask.
It was a subconscious choice.
Yeah, that's a really good association, Adrienne.
You never know. Would you like to add anything or
Or maybe speak about anything that's upcoming for you as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, upcoming exhibits, I have been asked to be in a group show called Get in the Game at SF MoMA. That's going to be showing my new work that opens in the October of 2024. That I'm showing sports artwork, which I feel like is a good continuation of this series or evolution of the series, because when you take away the politics of sports, it's really an activity that is about community and finding your own personal strength and confidence within your body. I'm also going to be in a show about reproductive rights at Dallas Contemporary Museum that also opens up in October 2024, and that's also a big group show.
Very interesting. I hope to get to see them. I travel to San Francisco from time to time. So are you excited?
Well, I am super excited. The whole family's gonna come out, and it's nice that they're showing new artwork, just because you always worry about new series, and
Totally. But I've been enjoying all the social content you've been doing, kind of giving like background to those works. It's been really interesting. And again, just a very worthwhile discussion and something that, I don't know, I've never seen portrayed in art.
yeah. You just keep on moving forward, making more art and hoping it makes an impact on people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it definitely has.
Well, I appreciate you showing the work and me being able to show it as a, Ukrainian American. It has meant a lot. I do really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm glad we could show it, and I'm glad we got in touch. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.